Hello and welcome to Deep Noetics. Today I've got James Cussen here from The Living Philosophy. He's literally here in the room with me, as you can see. And we thought we'd talk a bit about Jung, a bit about Ken Wilbur, continuing going a bit more in depth as well from our last conversation, which you can find on his channel. And I'd like to just start off asking you, James, how did you get into Ken Wilbur, and what is the spicy, important thing to know about Wilbur, and why is he relevant?
So it's funny, I came across Wilbur about a decade ago. Is that right? Yeah. So I was in Australia and I was doing this thing called HelpX, which is where you work like 5 hours. It's kind of like woofing. You work 5 hours a day with someone. And so I was in this guy's house in an intentional community, and he had all these amazing books, introduced me to just a lot of really interesting thinkers. And it was this saturation with all this new stuff. I think Brene Brown was the thing that really took to me at that point, because I was coming into an emotional, spiritual kind of thing. But he talked a lot about Ken Wilber, and I was just like, that sounds like a whole thing. I just don't. Yeah, there's so much depth there. I'll come back to that later. And mention people like Osho as well that I still haven't gone back to, who are who are kind of on my radar as like, I must look at that at some point. But then over the next few months in Australia, I really got into Jung, and for the next throughout my 20s, like mid-20s, I was obsessed with Jung, and most of what I read was in the Jungian kind of ballpark, or Nietzsche, who is kind of the main influence on Jung, I would say, aside from Freud.
Same here.
Yeah, and then I went for a hike during COVID and just walked for like 40 days, all the peninsulas of like Southwest Ireland, and just me alone in a tent. And yeah, at the end of that, I met my parents after 40 days somewhere in Cork, and the next day we went to a secondhand bookshop in a place called Macroom, and there was A Theory of Everything by Ken Wilbur, and I was like, oh, Ken Wilbur, that's the guy Gary was talking about. And then I read it and I was just like, oh my God, it was just like an immediate paradigm shift for me. It was like, oh, this is it's just completely different way of looking at the world from Jung and from Nietzsche. It was just, I couldn't see the bridge between them. I couldn't see where they overlapped. Like Wilbur talks a bit about Jung, but I wasn't really particularly convinced about what he was doing there. But I was like, this is an amazingly powerful way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
And from there I just started reading a lot of integral stuff, and then people around integral.
Spiral dynamics, is that tied to his theory of everything? I have to say, I have to admit some ignorance here, because I've only gotten some glimpse of Ken Wilber when I did a meditation retreat. I did a Vipassana 10-day silent meditation thing, and then someone there told me about it on the last day where we were finally allowed to speak again. He told me about this, and he told me about spiral dynamics. And I don't know, is that like a separate thing, or is his theory of everything tied to these spiral dynamics?
Yeah, spiral dynamics kind of, by the time he writes A Theory of Everything, which is around 2000, spiral dynamics is fully integrated into it. But it was pretty new to his system at that point. So Wilbur had been writing since the 80s, I think, maybe late 70s. Spiral dynamics had been developed in like the 50s and 60s by an American academic called Claire Graves, who just used to talk to a lot of students. I don't know whether he was involved in like inducting students into the university or showing them around or something, but he used to talk to students and from all different walks of life. And he began to see these, like, what he called, I don't know what he called them, but in spiral dynamics they're called like value memes. So they're like cultural memes of like developmental stages, because he noticed that he'd talk to students maybe when they came along, and then after 4 years he was like, oh, they're talking more like these people from, like that I would have met at this point. And so he started to develop this kind of like language of developmental stages and predictable phases that people could go through, which in hindsight is just like a very Hegelian thing of like these developmental phases throughout history. So that historical mindset seems to have just kind of like seeped in everywhere. And I think that actually, anyway, separate point, but I think that Darwin it fits much more into the landscape of things when you see that Hegel was like 50 years earlier, and you're like, oh, we were just ripe to understand evolution. But that's a completely different, separate point to explore. Like, I don't think Darwin could have happened 80 years earlier, because
Right.
the hierarchical mindset, and it's not that Darwin was influenced by Hegel, but that the zeitgeist, or this, we'll say this spiral dynamics stage, had been reached, at which, oh yeah, okay, we're now seeing things from a historical point of view rather than this eternal scientific essential kind of point of view. So we could see the developmental stages, and then naturally a theory of evolution could emerge very easily in that zeitgeist, or in that developmental stage, in that value meme, we'll say. So yeah, Claire Graves developed it, and then these two guys, forget their names now, Chris McCowan and Donald Beck, developed spiral dynamics and used it in South Africa in the 80s. So they took Graves's levels, which were like a typical academic he'd labeled with like these really boring, like A, B, A, Z, you know, all this just like alphanumeric kind of like nonsense that was very unsticky, and they gave them colors, and they gave them beautiful colors, and then it was like, oh yeah, you're orange, I'm purple, you know, it started to become this thing of like, okay, we've got all these people at these different color levels. And so it was this, also by giving it a color thing, you remove the hierarchical element a bit, which was interesting. So you could talk to people from different groups and get them to communicate with each other by understanding that they were operating from different value memes, so from different worldviews. So yeah, in South Africa, it was used kind of during the apartheid, the ending of the apartheid era, to be like, okay, how do we get the tribes people to talk to the Christians, to talk to the more modern capitalistic types, and like how do these different groups communicate? And so they started to use it as the system of communication. So that's 80s, probably early 90s, and then later 90s, Wilbur kind of finds it and is like, this is incredible. This fits with everything that I've kind of been talking about, because he was developing stuff out of Hegel and what's the guy from the Frankfurt School, the big guy in the
Adorno?
No, so like
Marcuse.
later. No, so later Frankfurt School, like 80s.
Marcuse?
No, so who was the other big one at the time of Marcuse?
Habermas?
Habermas, yeah. So like Wilbur's like mad about Habermas. Thank God you have some Frankfurt School knowledge, because I was just like, that name is not going to come back to me. So Wilbur kind of like Habermas, and I don't know whether Habermas is coming straight out of Hegel or whether this is a Marxian thing, but this developmental lineage that Wilbur's really tapped into, and then he gets the language of spiral dynamics, and so he's able to like really integrate it into his system, and he does a lot of work with, can't remember one of them, either McCowan or Beck, and then has this major falling out with them.
Okay.
And then he changes the colors. So everyone's used to this color scheme of like what they've done, and then Wilbur's like, yeah, but you know, I've fallen out with him, so I'm going to change it to a more logical color scheme. So he kind of just gives it like chakra colors.
It's funny, it kind of reminds me of karate. There's different like styles of karate, and a lot of them are like actually like enemies, and they have fallen out and stuff, and they differ often in the order of colors up to black belt, right? They all agree on the black belt, obviously being the master, the teacher belt, but the order of colors from white to black differs between the styles.
So that's basically what Wilbur did. Yeah, it's like what do they call it? The pettiness of small differences or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
But it was just like, okay, yeah, the color system might not be ideal, but it works, and we all have a language around it. So now there's just this schism where some people refer to teal, and I think they're talking about turquoise.
Right.
And I'm not fully sure like what the system overlap is. Some of the colors are the same, and some of the it's just like this. But yeah, so
it could be from Ireland.
Could be.
With the pettiness of small differences. If you're from a neighboring town.
Well, as long as it doesn't escalate to that level of Ireland has a deep tradition of pettiness of small differences. Exactly. Sometimes it becomes very, very petty.
Can I nail you down on your mentioning of memes? What were you saying there in regards to Wilbur there, or in regards to
so so spiral dynamics is a set of, each level is called a value meme. So there's like the purple value meme, there's the red value meme, the blue value meme, the orange, green, yellow, and turquoise. And then at yellow it becomes second tier, which is where everyone wants to be. So it's each of these is a value meme, which is to say that it's like a memetic complex of
Mm-hmm.
beliefs and from coming from Dawkins's language around memes.
Okay.
And
So it's inspired by Dawkins explicitly.
So Claire Graves wasn't at all. It's because Claire Graves was working before Dawkins published Selfish Gene, but I think Beck and McCowan just kind of like integrated Dawkinsian language, which was probably quite popular at the time. Like, could they have used the word paradigm or worldview? Quite possibly. Does meme sound cooler? Definitely.
Yeah.
So was that the main thing behind it? And it's probably also that it's self-propagating. These worldviews are, but again,
it's like a self-organizing system in a way. Like I feel with Jung, for example, is that he was in two ways a pioneer, and that's why I kind of nailed you down on the memes. I find on one hand he was a pioneer of phenomenology. I feel like he was already a phenomenologist before that notion was properly developed. But he was not really an in-depth philosopher, Jung, but he was like a very deep psychologist that implicitly assumed some sort of phenomenological basis to his worldview. I feel like when he speaks of God or he speaks of archetypes, he speaks of it more in the way Nietzsche speaks of it, rather than like some sort of metaphysical argument, right? He's not kind of
it's very much this. Yeah, it's more the psychoanalytical, like turning towards the inner world.
Exactly.
But I think for Jung it goes so deep that it becomes metaphysical, like explicitly in his later works, but like in his earlier works, he's
in like Ion, for example.
Yeah, so like by the time he gets to Ion is part 2 of that series, isn't it? It's in. By then it's just you're like, oh wow, you're going deep here. So like I think from the Red Book era, so whenever he developed it or discovered his method, it was already there, but then he was so attached to, and throughout Jung's work he kind of emphasizes this is empirical, this is scientific, I'm a scientist, but I'm being dragged in this direction. And so I think he's at pains to emphasize that it's empirical, but eventually he kind of he opens up more about the metaphysical thing, and
he's moved into, like, you could say, uncharted territory, of which then the groundwork was kind of more set by the phenomenologists. Like in my series where I talk about the unconscious, I have like a little series on my channel about the unconscious, which is kind of just more like a loud brainstorming. I'm trying to square being and time a bit with Ion. Like I'm trying to bring together the kind of have the ideas that are laid out in Ion and kind of see if I can put them in. It's almost like a plant. It's almost like an organism that I'm trying to find the right soil for. The soil, I feel like Heidegger was onto something when it comes to that, like new ground that is found through, like, let's say, actually beginning to think. And that's.
Can you articulate that a bit, like what you see as the overlap between those projects and what you were trying to do?
Well, so, for example, I think that both Jung and Heidegger both were kind of reconciling the two opposites of Nietzsche and Plato in a way. Like Nietzsche is in a way an anti-Plato, right? There's even an interesting old segment on German TV where they had people dressed up as each debating. Plato versus Nietzsche. I wonder if I can find with English subtitles. It's actually brilliant. Brilliant, especially for a TV segment. It's brilliant. And I think both of them were engaged in squaring that. Like Jung, kind of, the archetypes for me are nothing else but it's kind of the rebirth of sort of Platonic ideals after Nietzsche has torn down the false idols, you know. It's kind of like you have the ideas that have become idols of, you know, language and thought and all this, and they've become these rigid things that you can't actually square it anymore with the living world that the Greeks encountered. Like Plato, when he spoke about the ideas, it's probably something very different than what we do in our technical mindset now. So at his time, the world for the Greeks would have been way more, you could say, animistic, spiritual. We're more alive. And I feel like with current times, and I'm also wondering, like with Wilbur and these kind of figures, that, you know, this sort of spirituality of the animated world, that it's either it's coming back, or at least the desire for it to come back is present, you know. And
Yeah.
and I feel that what you have there is that the what was I going to say, the what Jung is doing is he recognizes the input that Nietzsche brought to the table. He recognizes the kind of critique, the valid tearing down of all of these, you could say, rational idols, these metaphysical idols. But he doesn't, you know, he doesn't just remain in the abyss. He doesn't just remain in the void, but kind of he allows these entities to come back. He allows the gods to come back in a new way. And so the archetypes are not fully defined. They're not exhaustively listed. There's not a set amount of 8 archetypes and with exact rigid definitions and exact rigid. That's not how they are. They are more kind of continuously evolving and alive.
And their boundaries are too fluid for them to have that rigorous conceptual thing put around them.
Exactly. And I feel like that's, you know, he's done that phenomenologically on a psychological level. And I feel like Heidegger, he's written a book, and I don't know if there's an English translation at all, but it's called something along the lines of the truth in Plato, something like that. And it's about, he refers to Nietzsche a lot, and it's about just the allegory of the cave. And he kind of brings them together in a way, Nietzsche and Plato. And I feel like his whole pursuit there is this dance, you know, between the origins of philosophy, the Platonic, Socratic, the focus on being, which is why his whole work is centered around the question of being. But at the same time, this rejection and destruction of metaphysics that Nietzsche kind of kicked off.